Hi, it's Larry Call from Change Agent Board. I'm here today with Erica Ahmed, and her company is called, that she founded is called ECain Consulting. Welcome, Erica. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you for having me.
So what we're going to talk about is, within our series on anti-racism, we're going to focus on some specific issues going on in business. There's been diversity programs in companies going back years, and we're in a different era with this now. And if you're an HR executive, if you're involved in this at any decision maker level in a corporation, I'm sure you're thinking about this right now. So we're going to talk about some alternative ideas to help you take this to the next level. Before we get into it, Erica, you want to just talk a little bit about what you're doing now and what your background is?
Sure. Well, my background is actually in mental health and public health, but I got into the space of doing consulting work in this particular space a couple of years ago. And really, it was more about helping nonprofits that wanted to sort of develop their own structure, and they were interested in making sure that they had something in the space of having diversity, equity initiatives.
Okay, great. So let's get into the issue around executives that don't necessarily have personal experience with systemic racism in their own life. So it's a very difficult leap to make to even really understand where the issues are. So how do they introduce racial equity programs in their across their organization then?
It's a couple things. One, they need to engage with people that have had lived experience, and there are probably some people that work for them in the corporation that do that as well. But also it's important, I think, to not try to take that on. It's important, if you can, to have a consultant or a third party that can come in and do a full-on assessment and to really get an understanding of the landscape and the culture and the climate.
So you start with an assessment typically, if somebody's going to take a look at this?
Yes. Even your internal folks, if they aren't equipped with that, then you should equip them with that to make sure that they definitely do an assessment, because you need to be able to have not only just quantitative data, you really need some really rich qualitative data to really sort of build out the story and to understand where you are in that moment in time.
And where does this start in a company? There's typically some kind of an HR structure, particularly in larger companies, and an existing diversity team. Is that where this is gonna kick off typically?
Typically, yes, but I would say in this climate, things are changing, and things, I think, for the better are becoming much more collaborative. So it's not so siloed that it's just, it's just with HR, or it's just with the diversity committee, and they have to bring it to the CEO. The CEO can very well come to them, or maybe the other employees are not part of the committee or not in HR that sort of, kick it off and get the ball rolling.
Is one of the challenges then being solved in a sense? So HR, the professionals who are responsible for this, are now finding this is getting to the top of the list, or maybe it was a we have to do it kind of item before?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely is happening. The other thing is that, this type of work it's always lived in HR. I don't know that is the best fit or the best place for it to live. And I think it really could be a standalone entity, and probably going forward deserves to be that in many spaces.
So when you say a standalone entity, what should that look like?
It's totally separate from HR. You have your chief of diversity employee, but they're not an HR person. I think no longer should this be collapsed.
So if you're talking about a chief of diversity, that sounds like somebody who's sitting in C-suite meetings.
They had better be, yes.
And has that not been the case before?
I think they have been there, but I don't think that they've had given the kind of voice and platform that was needed, because it was sort of collapsed and housed under the HR umbrella. I think it needs to be a standalone entity where it's just, one person, and they have their employees, and they sit there on equal footing with every other department in the business.
When you get involved in a company, are you finding that they are looking at that shift, or they've made that shift to broaden it out, or is this something they're not even aware of yet that needs to be done?
Yes. Letter C, number 3.
So letter C, there has not been the change.
Yeah, I sort of get people just sort of stare at me like, what? Like, you never thought about that? Not sure if it's a good idea. Say it again. Like, what do you mean? One more time? Yeah.
Well, it's a bit surprising in some ways to hear this. So if you look at what happened on May 25th, which was when George Floyd was murdered, I think for many people in the country, this didn't really start there, to start to think about this in a more systemic way. But for some people, it did,
Yeah.
or at least it raised into the broader public consciousness. So what has changed then? Where are we at right now if we're not at the point where we're actually understanding this is a corporate-wide, C-suite level issue?
I think we're getting there, but I don't think people are necessarily making a connection between, police brutality and what goes on in the workplace. But we should, because there's definitely alignment and there are, cohesive narratives that sort of connect the dots, but I don't know that we are fully there. The murder of Mr. George Floyd certainly did elevate what was going on. And for people that didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to be a part of it, it forced them to. So, but when you're forced to do something, you're not always operating at your best. And so where people are sort of clamoring and trying to get their footing and figure out how to go forward and what does forward look like.
What I hear you saying then is that there's a connection between the personal and the professional that perhaps was separated before. Is that what you're talking about?
I'm just saying that when you're Black, these things happen on a continuum and they happen in different spaces that you engage with in life, whether it's the grocery store, whether it's at the park, whether it's the workplace, whether it's driving down the car and the police pulls you over. So these are not siloed events in that sense.
So if they're not siloed events, what's the responsibility of the company to think about that in a more holistic life way?
I think just what you said, to think about it in a more holistic life. Like, if you're Black, you're not just this kind of Black at home, but this kind of Black in the workplace. You're always Black, and race is the calling card. Race is what we're talking about. So there has to be a way when CEOs do embrace this and really look at not just equality, but equity, meeting people where they are and making them whole.
Can you give an example of that then, of the difference between moving, not the difference, but what it looks like to move to equity?
Yeah, I would say, like, for example, let's say you're at work and everyone has a computer. That's great. The only problem is that in your office, you don't have a desk or chair or electric. So it's equal. Everyone has gotten a computer. But in order for there to be equity, you need to get a desk, a chair, and access to electricity.
So you're talking about, in that case, at home work?
Oh, no, I'm just in the office. I'm just equity, period. Just to say, well, everyone's equal. Everyone is getting this yellow folder, right? But some people didn't get the red, blue, or green folders. In order to work on the work in the yellow folder, you needed to have these earlier folders. So just making sure that wherever people are, you're meeting them so that they are whole, and then there can be equality. You have to have equity to get to equality.
You have to have equity to get to equality. So is that part of the assessment to understand those gaps are?
Absolutely. Yes. Because I don't think you'll go to a workplace where people will say, well, people aren't treated equally here. Everything is fair. I think everyone would say that. But is there equity? What does that look like?
So if you look at an understanding pre and post assessment, it sounds like you're really opening people's eyes when you bring them data.
Or making them close them really, really tight. Just depends.
Or making them close them really tight. So that's an interesting point, closing them really tight. When this happened back in May and June and so on, for example, business social media and LinkedIn just exploded. Everybody was talking about that. And then we had the recent incidents in Milwaukee. I don't see people talking about it anymore in business social media.
Right. The conversation has really died down.
Has the conversation died down, or is the interest and commitment also died down?
I think in some spaces people are committed and they are moving, sort of quietly under the radar and doing things. But I think for a large segment of the population, the commitment has sort of died down, and people are sort of like, I've done everything I think I can do, and this is just, this life moving forward.
I did an interview recently with George Kriza from Challenging Decisions, and it just keeps sticking with me what he was talking about. So he's talking about the adoption curve, which is more of a marketing sort of a business tool where you look at where are you in any particular moment in time in a niche. So you've got the pioneer phase, and then you get into the innovators, the early adopters. And I think that's, pioneers 5% and early adopters maybe 20%, forget the exact numbers. And then you have what's called the chasm. And the chasm is getting to what they call early majority, which is maybe another 30%. And that's where they're kind of watching. But when you get to that early majority, they're flooding in and they've made a major commitment. Where are we then? Are we in that kind of, fast follower, early adopter phase with this?
We're living in all those phases, I think. I really do. And then I think the other thing is that we're bombarded with so much information and a lot of mixed messaging that some people are just sort of, just almost frozen. But again, you do have those people that are still working, even, behind the scenes, they are still pushing forward. They've made this commitment in their workplace and this is what they're doing. The work is not easy, but they've committed to it. And the other thing people have to realize too, lip service, you have to pay more than lip service. This is about saying in the workplace, okay, you know what, there has been not only inequality, there's been inequity. What are we, those who hold the power and are in charge, what are we willing to share, forego, or let go? And that's tough.
It is tough. And I can give you an example from my own community where I live in a very diverse community, not just racially, but ethnically and economically, which cuts across race.
Right.
Actually, and there's some serious divides in the schools. So within the school system, one of the commitments is for equity. So everything is looked at in that lens. So if there's an equity issue around a kid who's going to be hurt more by not getting a spot in the physical classroom because there's only so many spots, because that kid's going to go first. Well, I've talked to some other people and they talk about resource hogging.
Right.
So there's a lot of parents where they know how to work that system and they know how to put pressure on the teachers and the principal, and they show up and they're very good at getting what they want for their kids.
Right.
Do you think that that's what happens often in the workplace as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. People definitely will advocate for themselves. And in the workplace, there are these natural relationships that you align with people based on race or based on ethnicity or based on age or based on the fact that you all live in the same community, that you golf together. I mean, both your kids are in hockey together. So you have these natural relationships that intentionally or unintentionally exclude others.
I think we're seeing a backlash, and it comes in that form often. I forget which tech companies, but there was definitely a movement of significant desire for change around equity, and then there was a backlash to that of people who felt they were being marginalized. So it was kind of flipped.
Right.
So the reality was being flipped into something that wasn't necessarily true because people felt they were giving up something.
Well, and that's, I go back to my point. What are the people that already are whole? What are they willing to share, forego, or let go?
So that's very challenging. So
Right.
because people have a natural inclination of protecting what's theirs, and it's just sort of inbred into humanity. So how do you help a company deal with that backlash? Because it could be quite significant and persistent.
Right. I think, well, part of it is that there is a part of it, I think, definitely is inbred in humanity, but a part of it also is, I attribute to cultural norms. And our culture is much more based on individualism. So I think that, workplaces are a microcosm of that. But what they can do is they can implement a culture shift. It will not happen overnight. There will be pushback. There will be resistance and resentment. But if you take incremental baby steps, certainly you can change the culture of an individual workplace.
What I heard you saying, again, goes back to that idea of this has to be at a chief diversity officer level. We have one person empowered by the organization at the top to push through this change.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. They have to lead by example. First of all, they have to be empowered, and they have to have the support of the CEO and the board, and they have to lead by example, and they have to be consistent.
So some companies are at the point where they've got the intention part down. They know they want to do that. But then I'm hearing you say there's a gap between the ability to move from there to actually executing.
There's a big gap between intention and implementation. Yes. Absolutely.
Intention versus implementation.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So do you find the core, let's say, market for your services and the kinds of things you do are those sorts of companies where there is that clear intention, maybe even publicly known?
Absolutely. Yes. So people, a lot of times they want to do the right thing, particularly in this climate. They want to do the right thing, but there is a balancing act. In me making this cultural shift in this workplace and doing things differently, do I want to deal with the resistance from some of my employees or some of my colleagues? Because we still have to be functional and keep be about the business of the company moving forward. So I mean, it can be a lot of challenges, but in order for it to be functional and work for everyone, it has to be done.
Well, let's talk about self-interest in this case. What do I get out of it if I'm running a company in terms of the responsibility I have to the various shareholders, stakeholders in that organization? How does this all be delivered?
I think you get retention. I think people sort of overlook the fact they lose a lot of good qualified employees, non-white employees, because they don't feel engaged. They don't feel valued.
I forget the company, but a major publisher has gone through this recently where they'd hired a lot of very talented younger people to come into the organization, ran into a brick wall of culture where this was a fashion oriented organization in terms of what they were offering. And there were some pretty significant fights where they were speaking the different language around you are a culture that is not equitable, and the people who were running it were saying you have to earn your place here, like we did. So there was this immediate conflict that arose. When you get into that kind of a situation, how do you help people work through that? It's just such a fundamental difference of opinion that you're not even talking about the same information.
Right. And I think sometimes we use language incorrectly. My earning or having seniority in the company doesn't address issues of inequity. Those are two different animals. So I think you have to make sure people understand language and are using it correctly, and definitely aren't weaponizing it, but using it in the correct context. Seniority has nothing to do with inequity.
Can you give an example of, let's say, a before and after in terms of a situation like that, where there's been an improvement?
I don't know that I have an example I can think of exactly what you're saying, but again, I go back to what I said about people have to be made whole. And so I don't have to have seniority. I don't have to have everything that you have access to, but I have to be on proper footing so that at some point I can get on that trajectory to seniority. You have to equip me.
So what does success look like then? One of the things you said is you have to have that senior commitment. Second, you have to have an expert in the organization or working with the organization that knows how to do the right kind of an assessment. You have to understand where the equity issues are, and you have to make people whole. What else do you need to have come out of this?
Integrity, character, and honesty. People have to be honest about the culture and climate and not be punitive when others speak about their lived experience in a particular workplace culture and climate.
That's very challenging. One of the things I've heard a lot is that Black people are exhausted by this conversation and having to explain themselves all the time, and that white people are afraid of saying the wrong thing and often being even publicly attacked because they're putting something out there, maybe even with good intentions, but that is racist. If you're seeing those kinds of dynamics, then how do you have an honest dialogue?
Well, again, you have to bring that third party and that consultant and that neutral entity in to be able to help people walk through the conversation. And yes, I think for sure Black people are tired of explaining it, but more importantly, we're tired of having to manage and deal with this and having to always sort of be on the defense and always having to, make sure that we do double the work and try to do it twice as fast because, the treatment is different. It's very, very different. And you see that at every level in corporate settings.
So we're at a moment in time where the desire for significant change trumps fatigue and the challenge of
I think if people know white, Black, and everything between, they know that change is coming and everyone's going to benefit from the change, people would be open to it. And that's where I say if you have a third party come in, people can participate in full disclosure and feel safe around doing it. Because things are so raw and so volatile still right now. Maybe this conversation can't take place with the CEO, the secretary, and the middle managers. Maybe you're not there yet.
If you're looking at an industry, often there's a stasis to it. So there's an industry of diversity. Diversity consultants and people who have been doing this in a professional way for a long time, who have the way to do it and the boxes that they check. What are those companies doing wrong?
Again, I think they're trying to do the work.
That's interesting. They're trying to do the work as opposed to empowering others.
Empowering others. But again, I think for this, it's good to have an internal person, but I think you have to have, again, that outside person that comes in and can be neutral and can, sort of help people that maybe feel like they would be punished or they would receive punitive action, know that this is a safe space where they can have conversations.
So facilitation of a long, difficult process is maybe missing.
And even the initial assessments probably ought to be segregated in that sense. Just get honest feedback about, one of the clients I worked with, they had people that were in the C-suite, they had middle managers, and they also had employees that worked at different plants and facilities on the ground. Those are very different conversations. and the tone and tenor was very different, and the feedback was very different. And so, but putting them all together initially, I think that would have been a nightmare. Those conversations happened and needed to happen separately.
If you're looking at the overall environment, what companies do you think are leading the way, getting this right?
I would say in the ones that are dealing like with the food industry, they actually, any company that has a structure where you have like, it's very varied. You have again, people that are in plants and facilities, middle managers, and then senior executives, and then even board. I would say that there's much more movement in that space, and for whatever reason, the engagement is different. The larger corporations, the ones that are much more stratified on paper, seem to be penetrating and making a little bit more progress than other industries.
That's interesting. So in certain industries, and how do you divide that out in terms of how you look at that? These are large conglomerates that are doing this right, distributed companies.
Yes, yes. Several large conglomerates. Yeah. And so for me, I don't even really, I mean, I haven't really thought about it as much until you asked me just now, but that's what I'm seeing. Because people would think, oh, smaller companies, it's easier to manage. The group is pretty tight knit. It's able, you're able to, make some real inroads there. But I'm finding that that's not necessarily the case. I think that it's just sort of easier to say, well, you know what, we're just going to continue to do what we're doing. We'll do what we can as things come about or evolve. But I don't see as much proactivity in that space. I don't know if the bigger companies feel pressure because maybe, someone will do a social media post about them, but their commitment seems to be different.
I wonder if it's an institutional advantage for really large companies because they're so system oriented. There's a system for everything.
Right.
To them, in some ways, for execution, this is just another system.
Right. It's very regimented, and part of that workplace culture is that people are used to new things being implemented, and they can make it very prescriptive, and people can get right on board with it. So I think there's some truth to what you're saying.
So if I'm running a company where I already have a really good Six Sigma program and institutional processes and rigor in place, I wouldn't think this. You would think that would be a harder environment to change. But I think this is a surprise to me. What I'm hearing from you is perhaps those are the best candidates.
Yeah, it's just, you're already doing these 16 steps. This is just number 17 to fold in, and we just, we do it like the first 16. So I think that because they are, sort of automated and regimented in a sense, I think it's a little bit easier. And again, I think their employees are receptive to it because it's part of the culture.
Yeah, because they're going to essentially want some kind of a regimented process to do it right.
Exactly. And to be able to monitor and assess and revamp. Exactly. Yeah.
And use assessment data, and then they have a common language and so on. This makes a lot of sense. It's very surprising because I think a lot of people think of it in terms of forward-thinking brands like a Nike that's been all over this for many years. But this is a kind of a hidden area.
Right, exactly. And we think about a Nike, someone's been doing it for many years. What have they been doing? And have they moved the needle forward, or has it been just more sort of like circular in nature? You know what I mean?
I don't know what goes on,
right?
But from a consumer standpoint, they're using this as a wedge opportunity to promote their brand in a certain market, maybe against another mindset.
Yeah.
So it's a brand. From a branding standpoint, there's just such a huge movement with things like conscious capitalism from John Mackey, the founder of Whole Foods, to broaden the responsibility of a company around looking at stakeholders, not just shareholders. And then there's some people at I forget the name at Kellogg here in Chicago and Evanston that are talking a lot about aligning a brand with a bigger purpose, like a Patagonia,
right.
For example. Is that sort of a company maybe not doing as good a job as they should be, or are they ahead?
In some ways they're ahead, in some ways they are shoulder to shoulder with everyone else, because when you talk about diversity, that's so huge. What are we talking about? Are we talking about, sexual orientation, gender, age, geography? What are we talking about? Because if we're talking about race, and I feel very strongly about this, I think when people talk about race, you really have to start with the black-white dynamic, because that's what we're talking, and then build out.
I think these things are getting conflated, and right now, and there's a book I read recently, and excuse me,
sure.
I'm going to turn around and make sure. It's called So You Want to Talk About Race.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things she's talking about is a little bit different from what you're saying. So she's she's separating these different strands out, but she's also saying they all have to be dealt with. Otherwise, there is an inequity to certain groups within that overall set.
Yeah.
Are you saying it's just really not, there's an order?
No, no, there's no pecking order, and they do have to all be dealt with. But I think what the problem, I'll say a little bit more about race. We tend to use phrases like people of color and this sort of thing, and non-white people. If we're going to talk about race, we have to be very specific. And again, I say deal with the black-white dynamic, because that's the history of this country. It's dealing with black people and white people and that relationship. And then you can build out and talk about other non-white people of color. I think what happens is that when you start saying white people and everyone else that's not white, you start losing a whole lot of, not addressing a whole lot of issues that need to be addressed. If you can fix the fundamental issue that happens and dealt with between white and black people, you can fix a whole lot of other things for other people as well. But the relationship, in that sense, there is a bit of a pecking order in terms of how people have access to privilege based on proximity to whiteness or the lack thereof.
I think it's a really important point that you're making, and what I think you're saying is that things can get watered down, and then you're also not solving for the underlying real issue, which is a historic issue.
Exactly. A historic issue that has and continues to have legs for like 401 years. If we work on that, we can really just, like I said, you can sort of just work outwards and really address other issues as well. But yes, things get watered down, conflated, and lost.
Is that challenging for you to cut through when you're talking about this?
Very much so. People don't want to necessarily talk about it, or they're more comfortable saying, minorities or people of color. And we really have to get down to the root cause of this, where it started, and really talk about American culture. That's what we have to really talk about. And American culture, when we talk about, racial inequity, when we talk about, discriminatory practice, structural racism, all that came about as a result of Black African slaves being brought here. So we really do have to provide historical context and deal with that. And we have not dealt with that. And people don't want to, it's uncomfortable, it's ugly, it's painful, but we just keep revisiting it in different ways all the time because we won't deal with it.
It does feel like it's this endless cycle where there's a beginning of a racial conversation, and then there's an immediate disruption of that conversation with people talking about Mount Rushmore and
anything else,
presidents, right? And anything except what the real issue is.
Right. A welcome distraction.
Welcome distraction, yeah. So you're bringing this fundamental mindset into large corporations that have some type of an institutional structure that enable them to change systems based on essentially data.
Yeah.
So that's where the biggest opportunities are.
Yes.
It sounds like that's really really tremendous. So you talked about your methodology, starting from the assessment, starting from facilitation of difficult conversations. What else needs to happen?
Well, for me, because my background is in public health, my theoretical framework is around harm reduction, which is normally for addiction and substance use. But I think it works well in terms of being able to mitigate any undue or more trauma. So I think first people have to commit to, okay, we're really going to do this. And then from there, the harm reduction model, which is, just incremental steps, is what can you do today? What can you do this week? What can you do collaboratively? What can this department do? What can this department do? Because I think if you try to do too much at once, people just shut down or disengage. Because with all of this, there's a lot of emotions involved. And people have to be able to process their emotions and be able to, do a brain dump and talk and engage and write, and feel what they feel.
Very challenging. If someone wanted to start to look at this and they wanted to talk to you, what would that initial step look like?
We'd have a Zoom call or initial conversation, and I want them to tell me, I want to know, why are you calling? What's going on? What's the impetus for this? Something's going on. Something's happened.
So with that first step, what's the best way that people can get in touch with you?
They can email me, erica14256@yahoo.com, or they can call me at 202-415-5800.
Great, and that's up on the screen. Is there anything else, Erica, that you'd like to leave the audience with?
Just to know that this is a journey. This is definitely a journey, and it didn't happen overnight, and it will take some time to get done, but it will work. And in the end, it really will be beneficial to everyone, even those that have to make concessions or that have to share or forego something. In the long run, particularly for a workplace, everyone will benefit, because you need to hold on to talent, and everyone needs to feel welcome and in a safe space in order to increase productivity and to increase sales.
Business imperatives are always going to be there, and that's the best way to motivate somebody. And they
Absolutely.
want to do the right thing, so they're
Exactly.
really not losing anything
Right. Exactly.
from,
Exactly.
from doing this. Thank you so much for coming and sharing. I think this will be very enlightening for people. Like you said, there's a lot of confusion around this, and everybody needs to start to think wherever they're at in their own organization about what they can do,
Yeah.
and then execute,
Yeah.
which is of course always the hard part. Um, um, so if anybody's interested in Change Agent Board, I've got the contact information up on the screen. We're bringing in people from across a lot of different industries that are doing interesting things, that are involved with changing any kind of organizational function, technology, operations, sales, to get a better performance result and overcoming the resistance to that change. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you. It's been wonderful. Take care.